We couldn't make it to the funeral because it was Jason's birthday party, but we're here now to discuss the trust fund. When do we get the money? Those were the first words my sister Victoria said to me. Not, "I'm sorry for your loss," not, "How are you holding up?" Not even a simple, "I'm sorry we couldn't be there." Just a cold, calculated question about money, asked in my living room 3 days after I'd buried my 7-year-old son. I stood there in the doorway of my own home, still wearing the same black dress I'd worn to the funeral because I hadn't had the energy to change. Still numb from grief so profound it felt like drowning. Still trying to comprehend how I was supposed to keep breathing, keep existing, keep living in a world where my child no longer existed, and my sister, my own flesh and blood, someone who'd known me for 35 years, was asking me about money. Behind her stood my mother Barbara, my brother Thomas, and Thomas's wife Michelle. All 4 of them, dressed casually like they were going to brunch or running errands on a Saturday afternoon. Jeans and sweaters, comfortable shoes, not the black of mourning, not the somber clothes of people who'd just lost a family member. Just normal, everyday clothing worn by normal people going about their normal lives while mine had been completely destroyed. They stood on my doorstep with expectant expressions on their faces. Not grief, not sympathy, not even basic human compassion, just expectation, anticipation, the look of people who'd come to collect something they believed was owed to them. "Excuse me?" I managed to say, my voice hoarse from 3 days of crying, 3 days of screaming into pillows so the neighbors wouldn't hear, 3 days of sobbing until I couldn't breathe, until my throat was raw, until I'd thrown up from the force of my grief. "The trust fund?" Victoria repeated, speaking slowly and clearly like I was stupid or hard of hearing. "Dylan's trust fund, the $2 million that his father's family set up for him when he was born. Now that Dylan is gone, that money has to go somewhere. It can't just sit there. We're family. We're his blood relatives. We should discuss how to divide it fairly among everyone who has a legitimate claim." Dylan. My son's name was Dylan. Dylan James Whitmore. He'd been 7 years old. 7 years, 3 months, and 12 days old when he died. He'd loved dinosaurs with an obsessive passion that had filled our house with toy dinosaurs, and dinosaur books, and dinosaur posters. He'd been able to pronounce Pachycephalosaurus perfectly at age 5. He'd loved astronomy, and would point out constellations at night, telling me facts about stars and planets he'd learned from the library books we'd check out every week. He loved building elaborate structures with Legos, spending hours constructing spaceships and castles and cities, narrating detailed stories about the Lego people who lived in his creations. He'd had his father's dark hair that never wanted to lay flat no matter how much I combed it. My green eyes would light up when he smiled. His father's intelligence and curiosity, my stubbornness and determination. He'd laughed at silly jokes and terrible puns. He'd hugged me every single night before bed, throwing his small arms around my neck and squeezing tight. He'd told me he loved me at least 17 times a day. I'd counted once, writing down each time he said it, treasuring the knowledge that my child felt safe enough and loved enough to express his feelings so freely and frequently. And he'd died 9 days ago in a car accident that had destroyed my entire world, shattered my reality, torn my heart out of my chest and left a gaping, bleeding wound that would never heal. My family, my mother, my siblings, their spouses, had not attended his funeral 3 days ago. They'd all been invited, of course. I'd sent them the details personally, texted them individually, called them to make sure they'd received the information, date, time, location. The small church where we'd held the service, St. Andrew's, the same church where Marcus and I had been married 8 years ago, where Dylan had been baptized as an infant. The cemetery where we'd laid him to rest, Riverside Cemetery, where Marcus was buried, so Dylan could be near his father. They hadn't come. None of them. Instead, they'd attended my nephew Jason's 8th birthday party, Victoria's son. A birthday party with a bounce house rented for $400 and a professional, magician hired for $600 and a chocolate, cake from an expensive bakery that cost $200. They'd chosen a child's birthday, celebration, an event that happens every single year, an event that could have been rescheduled or attended partially over my child's funeral. The one and only funeral my son would ever have. The final goodbye to a 7-year-old boy who would never have another birthday, never blow out another candle, never make another wish. And now, 3 days later, They were standing at my door asking about money. "Get out," I heard myself say, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. "Get out of my house right now." "Catherine, don't be dramatic," my mother said, her tone sharp and impatient, the same tone she'd used when I was a child and had disappointed her in some way. "We need to discuss this like adults. That money was meant for Dylan's future. Dylan doesn't have a future anymore, so the money should go to family members who can actually use it. That's just common sense. That's just practical thinking." "Dylan has been dead for 9 days, I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. 9 days. I buried him 3 days ago, alone, without any of you there. And you want to stand in my house and talk about his money?" "We explained why we couldn't make the funeral," Victoria said defensively, crossing her arms over her chest. "Jason's birthday party had been planned for months. Literally months, Catherine. We'd booked the venue, hired the entertainment, sent out invitations to 20 kids. We couldn't just cancel it at the last minute. Do you have any idea how much money we'd already spent? How disappointed Jason would have been. It would have traumatized him to cancel his party. Surely you understand that. Surely you can see that we were in an impossible position." I stared at her, unable to believe what I was hearing. Unable to process that my own sister, someone I'd known my entire life, someone I'd grown up with and shared a childhood with, genuinely thought that a birthday party, a party for an 8-year-old who would have many more birthdays, who was alive and healthy and would have countless opportunities to celebrate, was more important than her 7-year-old nephew's funeral. "Besides," Thomas added, shifting his weight from foot to foot uncomfortably, not quite meeting my eyes, "it's not like Dylan would have known we weren't there. He was already gone, Catherine. The funeral was just a formality, really. Just something for the living, for closure. It's not like our presence or absence actually changed anything. Dylan was already dead. He didn't care whether we were at the funeral or not. Just a formality. My son's funeral was just a formality to them. The service where I'd barely been able to stand, where I'd sobbed so hard I'd made myself sick, where I'd had to be physically supported by Marcus's parents because my legs wouldn't hold me. The burial where I'd thrown the first handful of dirt onto my child's casket and felt like I was burying my own heart along with him. The moment when I'd said my final goodbye to the person I loved most in the entire world. That was just a formality to them. Just an inconvenient obligation they'd chosen to skip in favor of a birthday party with a bounce house and a magician. "I want you all to leave," I said, my voice shaking with rage and grief and exhaustion. "Right now. Get out of my house." "We're not leaving until we discuss the trust fund," my mother said firmly, actually stepping forward into my house without invitation, her voice taking on that authoritative tone she'd used when I was a child, and she wanted to make it clear she was in charge. "Catherine, you're not thinking clearly. You're grieving, which is understandable. Grief is natural after a loss, but you can't let grief cloud your judgment about important financial matters. That money needs to be addressed. Dylan's trust fund represents a substantial amount of money, and it needs to be distributed appropriately among the family members who have legitimate claims to it." "Dylan's trust fund is none of your business," I said, my hands clenching into fists at my sides. "It was set up for Dylan by his father's family. It has nothing to do with any of you. It was never meant for you. You have no claim to it. No right to it. No business even asking about it." "But Dylan is dead," Victoria said bluntly, saying the words like they were simple facts rather than a knife to my heart. "He's not coming back. The money has to go somewhere. And we're his family. His grandmother, his aunt, his uncle. We're his blood relatives. We should inherit it. That's how these things work. That's how estates are distributed. Family inherits from family." "How do you even know about the trust fund?" I asked suddenly, a realization dawning. "I never told you the amount. I never even told you it existed. How do you know about it?" An uncomfortable look passed between the four of them. Victoria looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at Michelle. Michelle looked at my mother. My mother looked at the floor. Finally, Thomas cleared his throat. "We might have looked into it. After the accident, we just wanted to make sure you'd be financially stable, Catherine. We were concerned about you, so we did some research, made some inquiries, asked around, called a few people. We just wanted to understand your financial situation, for your own good, so we could help you if you needed help." They'd investigated my son's finances. While he was lying in a hospital bed, while the doctors were telling me there was no hope, while I was sitting at his bedside holding his small hand and begging him to wake up, begging God to let him live, praying for a miracle that never came. They'd been researching his trust fund. They'd been making phone calls and asking questions and finding out how much money he had. They'd been calculating how much they might be able to get their hands on if he died. The realization made me feel physically sick. My stomach churned. I tasted bile in the back of my throat. "Get out," I said again, louder this time, my voice shaking with rage. "Get out of my house now or I'm calling the police. I mean it. I will call 911 right now and tell them there are intruders in my home who are refusing to leave." "You're being unreasonable," my mother snapped, her face flushing red with anger. "We're trying to help you. We're trying to make sure that money doesn't go to waste. We're trying to ensure it's used properly, distributed fairly among the family members who deserve it. Catherine, you don't need $2 million. What would you even do with that much money? You have a job, you own your house, you're financially stable. Meanwhile, Victoria has children with educational expenses. Thomas has debt that's drowning him. I'm on a fixed income approaching retirement. We all have legitimate financial needs that Dylan's money could help address. Don't you think Dylan would want his money to help his family? To help his grandmother and his aunt and uncle and his cousins? Don't you think he'd want to make a difference in our lives? Dylan's money going to his mother isn't waste," I said, my voice rising to a shout, all my grief and rage and exhaustion finally breaking through the numbness. "And even if it were, it's still none of your business. None of your business at all. You didn't care enough about Dylan to come to his funeral. You couldn't be bothered to leave a birthday party to say goodbye to him. But you care enough about his money to show up 3 days later demanding your share? You have the audacity to stand in my house, in the home where my son lived and played and grew up, and tell me that his money should go to you instead of to me. Get out now!" They finally started moving toward the door, but the damage was done. The intentions were clear. The relationships were shattered. Victoria turned at the door, her face a mixture of anger and something that looked almost like desperation. "We're not giving up on this, Catherine. That money is family money, and we have rights to it. Legal rights. You'll be hearing from our lawyer. We're not going to let you keep $2 million that should be distributed among the family. This isn't over." "Yes, it is," I said. "It's over, all of it. You're not my family anymore. The family shows up for funerals. Family supports each other during grief. A family doesn't spend 9 days calculating how to profit from a child's death. You're not my family. You're just people I used to know. Now get out and don't ever come back." They left finally. I watched them walk to their cars, watched them drive away. Then I closed the door, locked it, collapsed against it, and cried until I couldn't breathe. That was 6 months ago. October of last year, the worst day in a series of worst days that started when my son died and hasn't really ended since. But today is different. Today is the probate court hearing where Dylan's trust fund will be officially distributed according to his father's family's wishes and the legal terms of the trust. Today is the day my family will discover that their greed was for nothing. Today is the day justice will finally be served. Let me back up and tell you the whole story, because you need to understand how we got here. You need to understand the full context of this nightmare. My name is Catherine Marie Whitmore. I'm 35 years old. I was married to a wonderful man named Marcus Whitmore for 8 years before he died. We had one child together, Dylan. And 2 years ago, Marcus died of pancreatic cancer at the age of 37, leaving me and Dylan to navigate life without him, to figure out how to be a family of 2 instead of 3. Marcus came from wealth, serious, generational, old money wealth. His grandfather had founded a pharmaceutical company in the 1950s, Whitmore Pharmaceuticals, that had developed several important medications and made the family hundreds of millions of dollars over the decades. Marcus's father, Richard, had grown up wealthy, had inherited a substantial fortune when his father died, had managed that money wisely and grown it even more. Richard and his wife Ellen lived in a beautiful home in Connecticut, vacationed in Europe regularly, donated generously to charities, and lived the kind of comfortable, elegant life that old money provides. Marcus had a trust fund himself, set up by his grandfather when Marcus was born, along with his 2 siblings, his younger brother David and his younger sister Caroline. Marcus had inherited substantial wealth. It was just part of how his family operated. The wealth was passed down through generations, carefully managed, protected through trusts and investments and conservative financial planning. The Whitmore family believed in securing the financial futures of family members, ensuring that each generation would be comfortable and stable and free from financial worry. When Dylan was born 7 years ago, 7 years, 9 months and 3 days ago, to be exact, Marcus's parents followed family tradition. They set up a trust fund for their first and only grandchild, $2 million, invested conservatively in a diversified portfolio of stocks and bonds, managed by the same financial advisors who'd been handling the Whitmore family money for decades. The money was meant to be accessible when Dylan turned 25, giving him a solid financial foundation as a young adult. The idea was that Dylan would have financial security when he finished college, when he was starting his career, when he was thinking about buying a home or getting married or starting a family of his own. He'd never have to worry about money for education or housing or starting a business. He'd have freedom and options that financial security provides. The trust was ironclad, drafted by excellent lawyers with very specific terms. Dylan would receive the full amount at 25. He could access portions of it earlier for education expenses if needed, but the bulk of it was meant to stay invested and growing until he was mature enough to manage it responsibly. If anything happened to Dylan before he turned 25, an outcome nobody wanted to even consider, but one that had to be planned for legally, the money would go to his surviving parent or parents to use as they saw fit. Richard and Ellen trusted me completely. They knew I'd loved their son deeply, knew I was a good mother to Dylan, knew I would honor Dylan's memory and use the money appropriately if the unthinkable ever happened. Marcus's death 2 years ago was devastating in ways I still can't fully articulate. We'd been married for 6 years at that point. We'd built a good life together, a comfortable home, stable careers, a beautiful son, plans for the future. We were happy, genuinely happy. Not perfect, no marriage is, but happy in all the ways that mattered. Then Marcus started having back pain, started losing weight, started feeling tired all the time. He went to the doctor thinking maybe he'd pulled something at the gym. Maybe he needed to eat better. Maybe he was just stressed from work. They ran some tests. Found something concerning. Ran more tests. Found something terrifying. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. Already spread to his liver. Inoperable. Terminal. From diagnosis to death was only 4 months. 4 months of watching the man I loved waste away. 4 months of brutal chemotherapy that made him sick and weak, but didn't stop the cancer's progression. 4 months of watching him get thinner and paler and more exhausted. 4 months of him trying to be strong for Dylan and me while we all knew what was coming. Dylan was 5 years old. He couldn't really understand what was happening. He knew Daddy was sick. He knew Daddy went to the hospital a lot. He knew Daddy couldn't play catch anymore, or lift him up or chase him around the yard. But he didn't understand that Daddy was dying, that Daddy wouldn't get better, that soon Daddy would be gone forever. How do you explain death to a 5-year-old? How do you prepare a child for the loss of his father? I tried. I read him books about death and loss. I answered his questions as honestly as I could. I told him that Daddy's body was very sick and the doctors couldn't fix it. I told him that soon Daddy would go to heaven and wouldn't be sick anymore, but we wouldn't be able to see him. Dylan had asked the questions that break your heart. Will Daddy still love me in heaven? Yes, buddy, Daddy will always love you. Can Daddy come visit us sometimes? Daddy will always be with us in our hearts and memories. Will I ever see Daddy again? Someday, when you're very old and you go to heaven too, you'll see Daddy again. Marcus died at home, which is what he wanted. Hospice nurses helped us keep him comfortable in our bedroom. Dylan and I were with him at the end. Marcus was barely conscious, heavily medicated for pain, but he opened his eyes one last time when Dylan took his hand. I love you, buddy, Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. Take care of Mommy for me. Be a good boy. I will, Daddy, Dylan had said, tears streaming down his 5-year-old face. I promise. I'll take care of Mommy. I love you. Those were the last words Marcus heard before he died, his son promising to take care of me. The funeral was awful but well attended. Marcus had been loved by many people. His family, his large network of friends, his colleagues from the investment firm where he'd worked, neighbors, people from our church, parents from Dylan's preschool. The church was packed. People stood in the back because there weren't enough seats. Everyone wanted to pay respects to Marcus, to support me and Dylan, to say goodbye to a good man who'd died too young. My family attended that funeral. They showed up, wore black, said the right things. My mother hugged me and told me she was there for me. Victoria told me to call if I needed anything. Thomas offered to help with anything I needed around the house. They all seemed appropriately sad, appropriately supportive, appropriately family-like. After the funeral, after the reception, after everyone went home, it was just me and Dylan, a 5-year-old and his grieving mother, trying to figure out how to live in a world without Marcus, trying to establish new routines, new normal, new ways of being a family when 1/3 of our family was gone. Richard and Ellen Whitmore were destroyed by their son's death, but they rallied for Dylan's sake and mine. They were present grandparents, deeply involved in Dylan's life, despite their own grief. They took him for weekends at their house, letting me have time to grieve alone or catch up on work or just exist without having to be strong for my child. They took him for summer weeks, creating special memories and adventures. They spoiled him appropriately, toys and treats and trips to fun places, but also taught him good values and manners and respect. They loved him fiercely, completely, the way grandparents should love their grandchildren. They helped me financially during the hardest times. Marcus's medical bills had been astronomical even with good insurance. Experimental treatments not covered by insurance. Hospitalizations, medications, medical equipment. By the time Marcus died, we'd burned through most of our savings and had significant medical debt. Richard and Ellen quietly paid off what we couldn't cover. They told me not to worry about it, that family takes care of family, that Marcus would have done the same if the situation were reversed. They never made me feel like I owed them or like I was a burden. They just helped because that's what good people do. My own family, my mother Barbara, my older sister Victoria, my younger brother Thomas, had always been more complicated. We'd never been particularly close. We'd never had that warm, supportive, always there for each other dynamic that some families have. We were more like people who happened to be related but didn't really understand each other or share values or have much in common beyond DNA. My mother Barbara was 63 years old and had spent her entire life being status-conscious and materialistic. She cared deeply about appearances, about what the neighbors thought, about having the right car and the right house and the right furniture and the right friends. She measured success exclusively in dollars and possessions. She'd raised us to believe that money and status were the most important things in life, that accumulating wealth and displaying it were the primary goals of existence. She'd married my father when she was 23, had 3 children by the time she was 30, and spent the next 3 decades being obsessed with keeping up with the Joneses. She'd always wanted us to marry well, live in expensive houses, have impressive careers that she could brag about to her friends. She valued external success over internal fulfillment, possessions over relationships, status over substance. Victoria was 38 and had followed in my mother's footsteps with religious devotion. She'd married Greg Sullivan, a successful orthodontist who made approximately $300,000 a year. They had 2 children, Jason, who was now 8, and Emma, who was 6. They lived in a large 4-bedroom house in an expensive suburb with good schools and wealthy neighbors. Victoria spent her days shopping at expensive stores, lunching at trendy restaurants, getting her hair and nails done at upscale salons, and posting carefully curated photos on social media that made her life look perfect and enviable. She was obsessed with status and competition. She constantly competed with other mothers about whose children were more accomplished, whose kids were in more activities, whose kids got better grades, whose kids were more popular, whose kids wore more expensive clothes. She competed about vacations. She had to go somewhere more exotic, more expensive, more Instagram-worthy than her friends. She competed about everything: her house, her car, her husband's income, her own appearance, her children's achievements. She lived in a constant state of comparison and competition, always trying to prove she was better than everyone else, always trying to maintain her position in the social hierarchy. Thomas was 32 and worked in pharmaceutical sales, making decent money, around $80,000 a year plus commissions. He'd married Michelle, who worked in marketing and made about $60,000. Together, they had a combined income of $140,000, $150,000, which should have been comfortable. But they lived beyond their means constantly and dramatically. They'd bought a condo they couldn't really afford in an expensive area because they wanted a prestigious address. They drove luxury cars, A BMW for him, an Audi for her, both leased at ridiculous monthly rates. They wore designer clothes purchased on credit cards. They took lavish vacations they couldn't afford, financing trips to Europe and the Caribbean on credit. They were drowning in debt, credit card debt, car leases, personal loans, but refused to admit it or change their lifestyle. They were determined to look successful even if the reality was financial disaster. I'd never fit with them. I'd always been different, always valued different things, always made choices they didn't understand or approve of. I'd married Marcus for love, not money. Yes, Marcus had money. His family had wealth. But I'd fallen in love with him before I even knew about his family's financial situation. We met in college. I'd been studying education, he'd been studying finance. We met at a party thrown by mutual friends. We'd talked for hours about books and movies and travel and philosophy and discovered we had amazing chemistry. We'd started dating, fell deeply in love, got married after 2 years of dating. I'd loved him for who he was, his intelligence, his kindness, his sense of humor, his values, his character. The money was irrelevant to me. I'd become a second-grade teacher, working with young children, making a modest salary of around $50,000 a year doing work I genuinely loved. I didn't care that I'd never be wealthy from teaching. I cared about making a difference in children's lives, about helping them learn to read and do math and think critically and solve problems and be good humans. Every year I had a classroom full of 7- and 8-year-olds who I got to teach and nurture and watch grow. It was meaningful work that I found deeply fulfilling. Marcus and I had lived in a normal 3-bedroom house in a middle-class neighborhood. Not a mansion, not an expensive area, just a comfortable home with a yard where Dylan could play and good neighbors and decent schools. We'd driven practical cars. I had an SUV, Marcus had a sedan, both reliable and safe but not luxury vehicles. We'd valued experiences over possessions, family trips to the beach, visits to museums, walks in the park, game nights at home. We'd been happy with a simple life that prioritized time together over material accumulation. My family had always looked down on me for those choices. They'd made snide comments about my little teacher salary, as if my career was somehow embarrassing or inadequate. They'd asked pointed questions about when Marcus and I would move to a bigger house in a better neighborhood, get nicer cars, live more like his family's wealth suggested we should. They'd seemed disappointed that I was content with a modest lifestyle when I'd married someone from a wealthy family. After Marcus died, there were some uncomfortable conversations about money. My mother had asked bluntly how much life insurance Marcus had, as if it was any of her business. Victoria had asked if Marcus's family would take care of me financially, with an emphasis that suggested she was really asking if I'd be inheriting significant money that might eventually come to her. Thomas had asked if I'd be selling the house and moving somewhere cheaper now that I was a single mother on a teacher's salary. I'd shut down those conversations quickly and firmly, telling them my finances were my own business. But I could see the calculations happening behind their eyes, the mental assessment of what I had and what they might eventually be able to get from me. I'd kept Dylan's trust fund completely private. I'd never mentioned it to my family, not the existence of it, not the amount, nothing. It was none of their business. The trust was between Dylan and his father's family. It had nothing to do with my side of the family, and I knew, even then, even before everything that happened, that telling them about it would only invite problems. They'd start treating Dylan differently. They'd start seeing him as a source of future money, rather than a child to love for his own sake. They'd start calculating and planning and positioning themselves to benefit from Dylan's trust fund somehow. So I kept it private. The only people who knew about the trust were me, Marcus's parents, the lawyers who'd set it up, and the financial advisors who managed it. My family had no idea it existed, and I wanted to keep it that way. After Marcus died, I'd focused entirely on Dylan and on healing from our loss. We'd gone to grief counseling together, a therapist who specialized in helping children process death and loss. I'd read Dylan books about death and dying, age-appropriate, stories about children who'd lost parents, books that helped him understand what had happened and why. I'd answered his endless questions about death and heaven and where Daddy was, and whether Daddy still loved us, and whether Daddy could see us, and whether Daddy was proud of him. I'd held him while he cried, and cried myself after he fell asleep at night. Dylan had been an amazing kid, Truly amazing. Smart and funny and creative and kind. He'd inherited his father's quick intelligence and insatiable curiosity about how the world worked. He'd inherited my stubborn determination and my love of reading. He'd been a perfect combination of both of us, the best parts of Marcus and me combined into one incredible child. He'd loved dinosaurs with an obsession that bordered on encyclopedic knowledge. At age 5, he could identify 50 different species of dinosaurs by sight. He could pronounce names like Parasaurolophus and Ankylosaurus and Deinonychus without hesitation. He'd watch dinosaur documentaries and tell me facts about when they lived and what they ate and how big they were. His room had been decorated entirely with dinosaurs, dinosaur bedding, dinosaur posters, dinosaur toys covering every surface. When other kids his age were into whatever the latest cartoon was, Dylan was into the Mesozoic era. He loved space and astronomy too. We'd go outside at night and he'd point out constellations he'd learned from the library books we checked out every week. "That's Orion, Mommy. See his belt, those 3 stars in a row? And that's Betelgeuse, the red star on his shoulder. It's a red supergiant, and someday it's going to explode into a supernova." He'd been 7 years old and throwing around terms, like red supergiant and supernova, like they were common vocabulary. He loved building things. Legos were his absolute favorite. He'd spend hours constructing elaborate spaceships and cities and vehicles, narrating detailed stories about the Lego people who inhabited his creations. He'd build something, play with it for a while, then carefully take it apart and build something new. His imagination was boundless. His creativity was remarkable. His focus and concentration while building were beyond what you'd expect from a 7-year-old. He'd had his father's dark hair that stuck up in the back no matter how much I combed it or tried to flatten it with gel. My green eyes that would light up with excitement when he learned something new or figured out how something worked. Marcus's strong chin and my small nose. He'd been beautiful. Not in the generic way people say about all children, but truly, objectively beautiful. People would stop us in stores to tell me what a handsome son I had. Other mothers would ask if he'd ever modeled because he was so photogenic, but more than his appearance, he'd been beautiful on the inside. He'd been kind to other children, even the ones who weren't kind to him. He'd been gentle with animals, patient with younger kids, respectful to adults. He'd said please and thank you without being prompted. He'd helped without being asked. He'd shared his toys. He'd been empathetic when others were sad or hurt. He'd been genuinely good, the kind of child who gives you hope for humanity's future. He'd laughed at silly jokes and terrible puns. I'd tell him knock-knock jokes that were objectively awful, and he'd laugh like they were the funniest things he'd ever heard. Knock knock. Who's there? Interrupting cow. Interrupting cow. Moo! And he'd dissolve into giggles, asking me to tell it again and again. He'd hugged me every single night before bed, no matter what. Even if he was mad at me about something, bedtime or vegetables or screen time limits, he'd still hug me goodnight. He'd throw his small arms around my neck and squeeze tight and say, "I love you, Mommy. You're the best mommy in the whole world." Every single night. Without fail. He'd told me he loved me constantly throughout the day. "I love you, Mommy," when I made him breakfast. "I love you, Mommy," when I drove him to school. "I love you, Mommy," when I picked him up. "I love you, Mommy," when I helped him with homework. "I love you, Mommy," when I tucked him in. At least 17 times a day. I'd counted once, writing down each time he said it over the course of a day, treasuring the knowledge that my child felt safe enough and loved enough to express his feelings so freely and so frequently. And then he was gone. Just gone. Erased from existence in a split second by a drunk driver who'd decided to get behind the wheel at 10 a.m. on a Saturday morning with a blood alcohol level twice the legal limit. September 23rd of last year. The day that destroyed my world completely and irreversibly. It was a beautiful Saturday morning. Perfect fall weather. Temperature in the mid-60s, sunny, slight breeze, leaves just starting to change colors. Dylan and I were driving to his soccer game. He'd joined a recreational league that fall, playing on a team with other 7-year-olds. He wasn't particularly good at soccer. His coordination and athletic ability were just average. But he enjoyed it. He liked being part of a team, liked running around outside, liked the orange slices and juice boxes at halftime, liked getting a participation trophy at the end of the season. We were in my SUV, stopped at a red light about a mile from the soccer fields. The radio was playing a song Dylan liked, some pop song that was popular that year. He was singing along in the back seat, his voice slightly off-key but enthusiastic. He was wearing his soccer uniform, blue jersey with number 7, white shorts, shin guards, cleats. His hair was sticking up in the back like always. He had a grass stain on one knee from practicing in the backyard the day before. I'd looked at him in the rearview mirror. He'd caught my eye and smiled. "I love you, Mommy," he'd said. "I love you too, buddy. You ready for your game? I'm gonna score a goal today. I can feel it." Those were the last words I heard my son speak. "I'm gonna score a goal today." Then a Dodge Ram pickup truck ran the red light at approximately 60 miles per hour and slammed into the driver's side of my SUV. The impact was catastrophic. The force of the collision spun my vehicle around. The sound was deafening, metal crunching, glass shattering, airbags deploying. Everything happened in slow motion and at lightning speed simultaneously. 1 second we were singing and talking and heading to a soccer game. The next second there was just noise and violence and chaos and pain. I don't remember much of the immediate aftermath. I remember the airbag deploying and hitting my face. I remember pain in my chest and my arm. I remember trying to turn around to check on Dylan but not being able to move. I remember calling his name. I remember people's voices around the car. I remember someone saying, "Call 911." I remember someone saying, "There's a child in the back seat." I remember someone opening my door. Someone saying, "Ma'am, don't try to move." Someone telling me an ambulance was coming. I remember asking, "Is my son okay?" Over and over. "Is Dylan okay? Please check on Dylan. Please help Dylan." I don't remember anyone answering me. I woke up in the hospital 2 days later. I'd been in surgery. I'd been unconscious. I'd suffered broken ribs, a broken arm, a severe concussion, internal bleeding that required emergency surgery. I'd been in critical condition. They'd had to put me in a medically induced coma while they repaired the damage. When I woke up, everything hurt. My body felt like it had been shattered and badly reassembled. I couldn't move without pain shooting through every nerve. My head felt like it was full of broken glass. But none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was Dylan. A nurse was checking my vitals when I opened my eyes. She saw me waking up and called for a doctor. "Where's Dylan?" I croaked, my voice barely working. "Where's my son? Is he okay?" The look on the nurse's face told me everything before anyone said the words. She had tears in her eyes. She reached for my hand. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "No," I said. "No. Where is he? Where's Dylan? I need to see him." "I'm so sorry. Your son didn't survive the accident." "No," I said again, trying to sit up despite the pain, despite the tubes and wires connected to my body. "No, that's not true. Where is he? I need to see him. Dylan! Dylan!" The doctor rushed in. More nurses. They were trying to calm me down, trying to keep me from hurting myself, trying to sedate me. But I was screaming for my son. Screaming that it wasn't true, couldn't be true, wouldn't believe it until I saw him. They sedated me, put me back to sleep, kept me heavily medicated for the next day because every time I woke up and remembered, I'd start screaming again. Eventually, Richard and Ellen Whitmore came to see me. Marcus's parents, Dylan's grandparents. They sat by my hospital bed, both of them with devastated faces, both of them crying. and they told me what had happened. Dylan had died on impact. The driver's side collision had been so severe that despite the booster seat, despite the seatbelt, despite the airbags, despite everything designed to keep children safe in car accidents, none of it had been enough. The impact had been too severe. He'd died instantly, they told me. The doctors said he hadn't suffered. He'd been here 1 second and gone the next. He'd been 7 years old. 7 years, 3 months, and 12 days old. He'd been on his way to a soccer game where he'd been planning to score his first goal. He'd died before he could score that goal, before he could grow up and learn to drive and go to college and fall in love and have children of his own, before he could become the amazing adult I knew he would have been, before he could do any of the things he'd dreamed about doing. My son was dead, and I'd survived. That was the cruel mathematics of the accident. The drunk driver had hit the driver's side. I'd taken the brunt of the impact. Dylan had been in the back seat on the driver's side, directly behind me. The impact had killed him instantly while leaving me alive but broken. I'd screamed when Richard told me. Screamed and thrashed and tried to get out of the hospital bed, tried to go to wherever they'd taken Dylan's body, tried to bring him back somehow. They'd had to sedate me again, had to restrain me because I was tearing my stitches and hurting myself. I don't remember any of that clearly. It's all a blur of pain and grief and medication and people telling me to calm down while my world ended. I spent 5 days in the hospital, 5 days of physical healing while my emotional wounds grew deeper and more infected, 5 days of physical therapy to relearn how to walk without feeling like I'd collapse, 5 days of pain medication that dulled my body's pain but couldn't touch the agony in my heart, 5 days of people telling me I was lucky to be alive when all I felt was cursed to have survived when my child hadn't. Richard and Ellen visited every single day. They sat by my hospital bed even when I couldn't talk, couldn't respond, could barely acknowledge their presence. They held my hand. They cried with me. They talked to me about Dylan, sharing memories, telling me again and again that it wasn't my fault, that there was nothing I could have done, that the drunk driver was responsible, that I couldn't have prevented it or predicted it or stopped it. They helped make funeral decisions because I was in no state to make them myself. What kind of casket? What kind of service? Where to bury him? Every decision was agony. Having to choose things for my child's funeral. Having to plan for saying goodbye to someone I'd never wanted to say goodbye to. We decided to bury Dylan next to Marcus at Riverside Cemetery. Father and son together. The thought gave me some small comfort. That Dylan wouldn't be alone. That he'd be next to his daddy. That they'd be together again. My family called during those 5 days in the hospital. My mother called to express shock and sympathy, to say she was so sorry about Dylan, to ask if there was anything she could do. Victoria called crying, saying she couldn't believe it, that she was devastated. Thomas called to say he was there for me if I needed anything. They all sounded appropriately shocked and sad and supportive. The funeral was scheduled for October 3rd, 10 days after the accident. The doctors wanted to keep me in the hospital longer, but I insisted on being discharged in time for Dylan's funeral. I couldn't miss my own son's funeral. I couldn't let them bury him without me there. So they discharged me on September 30th, 3 days before the funeral, with strict instructions to rest and let others take care of me. I couldn't go back to my house. Couldn't face walking into the empty home where Dylan's room still had his toys and his bed and his drawings on the walls and everything that remained of him. Couldn't face sleeping in my bed knowing Dylan would never crawl into it again when he had nightmares or came to wake me up on Saturday mornings. Couldn't face the constant reminders that he was gone. So I went to stay temporarily with Richard and Ellen. They had a guest room. They took care of me, made me food I couldn't eat, sat with me when I cried, gave me space when I needed to be alone with my grief. They were grieving too. They'd lost their only grandchild, but they put their own grief aside to take care of me because that's what good people do. I called my family with the funeral details. Called each of them individually to make sure they had the information. October 3rd, 2:00 p.m., St. Andrew's Church, followed by burial at Riverside Cemetery. My mother said, "Of course we'll be there. All of us. We wouldn't miss it." Her voice had sounded sincere. She'd sounded like a mother who understood that her daughter needed her family at her child's funeral. Victoria said, "We'll all be there. Jason and Emma too. They need to say goodbye to their cousin. We'll be there for you, Catherine. I promise. She'd sounded genuine. She'd sounded like a sister who would show up for the most important and most painful day of my life. Thomas said, "We'll be there." "Michelle and I will both be there. We're so sorry, Catherine. We'll be there to support you." He'd sounded like a brother who understood what family means. October 3rd arrived. Ellen helped me get dressed because my broken arm and healing ribs made it difficult to dress myself. I wore a simple black dress. No jewelry except my wedding ring. No makeup because what was the point? I'd just cry it all off anyway. My hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. We arrived at St. Andrew's Church early. The funeral director had already delivered the casket. It was in the front of the church, closed, covered with a spray of white flowers. Seeing it, seeing my child's casket, so small because he'd been small, child-sized because he'd been a child, nearly destroyed me all over again. I stood in the church entrance staring at that small casket and felt my legs give out. Richard caught me. He and Ellen helped me to the front pew, one on each side of me, physically supporting me because I couldn't support myself. People started arriving. Marcus's family, his brother David and wife, his sister Caroline and husband, various aunts and uncles and cousins. Marcus's friends from work, my friends, fellow teachers from my school, neighbors from my street, parents I'd gotten to know from Dylan's school and soccer team. Dylan's teacher, a wonderful woman named Mrs. Patterson who'd loved Dylan and who sobbed throughout the entire service. Dylan's soccer coach, kids from Dylan's class who came with their parents, 7-year-olds who didn't fully understand death but knew their friend was gone. The church filled up. More than 100 people came to say goodbye to a 7-year-old boy who'd touched so many lives in his short time on Earth. 2:00 came. The service was scheduled to start. I sat in the front pew between Richard and Ellen, barely able to stand, barely able to breathe, barely able to exist in a reality where I was attending my child's funeral. My family wasn't there. I kept looking back at the doors, expecting them to arrive late, expecting to see my mother and Victoria and Thomas slip in quietly, apologetic for their tardiness but present. But the doors stayed closed. The church was full, but my family wasn't in it. The service started. The pastor spoke about Dylan's bright spirit and kind heart. He talked about Dylan's love of learning, his curiosity about the world, his kindness to others. He read the 23rd Psalm. He talked about heaven and eternal life and how Dylan was with God now, free from pain, reunited with his father. Marcus's brother David gave a eulogy that made everyone cry. He talked about how excited Marcus had been when Dylan was born, how Marcus had been the proudest father who'd ever lived, how Marcus had loved that little boy with every fiber of his being. He talked about Dylan's intelligence and creativity. He talked about a recent phone call where Dylan had explained to him in detail how stars formed, using words David had to look up later because Dylan's vocabulary was so advanced. He talked about how unfair it was that Dylan's life was cut short, how much potential had been lost, how the world was robbed of whatever amazing things Dylan would have gone on to do. I was supposed to speak. I'd written something, words about my beautiful boy, about how much he'd meant to me, about what a gift he'd been. But when it came time for me to stand and speak, I couldn't do it. I couldn't move. I couldn't make words come out. I just sat there crying silently, my body shaking, my heart completely shattered. Ellen stood instead. She took my written words to the podium and read them for me, her voice breaking multiple times but pushing through. She read about how Dylan had been the light of my life, how becoming his mother had been the greatest blessing of my existence, how every day with him had been a gift, how he'd made me a better person just by being himself, how I'd loved him more than life itself, how I'd have traded places with him in a heartbeat if it meant he could live, how I didn't know how to exist in a world without him, but I'd have to figure it out somehow. By the time Ellen finished reading, there wasn't a dry eye in the church. People were openly sobbing. The sound of grief filled the sacred space. We went to the cemetery, followed the hearse carrying my child's body, watched as they lowered the small casket into the ground next to Marcus's grave. I threw a white rose onto the casket, a tradition, a final goodbye, a last offering. And I felt like I was dying right along with him, like part of me was being buried in that ground too. My family still wasn't there. Not at the church, not at the cemetery, not anywhere. After the burial, there was a reception at the church hall. Food that people had prepared that I couldn't eat because grief had stolen my appetite entirely. People offering condolences that I could barely hear through the fog of grief. Hugs from people whose faces I couldn't really focus on. Everyone being kind, everyone saying the right things, everyone trying to help in a situation where no help was possible. I made it through somehow. Smiled at people when they spoke to me, even though I felt nothing resembling happiness. Accepted hugs, even though I felt nothing resembling comfort. Thanked people for coming, even though gratitude felt impossible. Finally, Richard and Ellen took me back to their house. I collapsed on the guest bed, fully dressed, and cried until I fell asleep from exhaustion. When I woke up hours later, it was dark outside. I checked my phone for the first time all day. There were several missed calls, dozens of texts from people who'd been at the funeral, messages of support, offers to help, expressions of sympathy, and several texts from Victoria, sent earlier that day. Hey, I know this is bad timing, but Jason's birthday party is today too. Remember? We scheduled it months ago. We're going to try to make both events work if we can. The party is running a bit long. The magician is taking forever. Not sure we'll be able to make it to the funeral, so sorry about the timing. Party went great. Jason had such a good time. He was so happy. Sorry we couldn't make the funeral. The party just ran too long, and by the time it ended, the funeral was over. We'll stop by soon to see you and pay our respects. Love you. I stared at the texts, unable to process what I was reading, unable to believe that my own sister, my own flesh and blood, had chosen her son's birthday party over my son's funeral. Jason's 8th birthday party. A party that happens every year. A party that could have been shortened or rescheduled or attended partially. They could have left early to come to the funeral, or come to the funeral first and joined the party late. But they'd chosen to stay at the party, chosen to watch a magician perform tricks and sing happy birthday and eat cake, chosen convenience and comfort over showing up for family in the worst moment of grief. My mother hadn't come. Victoria hadn't come. Thomas hadn't come. Michelle hadn't come. None of them. They'd all gone to Jason's birthday party instead. I'd buried my 7-year-old son alone, without my family there, while they ate cake and watched a bounce house and celebrated a child who was alive while I mourned a child who was dead. I didn't respond to Victoria's texts. I turned off my phone. I lay in the guest bed at Richard and Ellen's house and stared at the ceiling and tried to understand how people I'd known my entire life could be so cruel, could value a birthday party over a funeral, could choose entertainment over supporting family in grief. 3 days later, on October 6th, I finally went home to my house. I'd been at Richard and Ellen's for a week. I needed to go back eventually. Needed to face the empty house. Needed to start figuring out how to live in a world without Dylan. Walking into that house was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Everything reminded me of him. His shoes by the door, his coat on the hook, his backpack hanging where he'd left it before we'd gone to the soccer game he never made it to. I walked upstairs to his room, opened the door. The room still smelled like him. That particular little boy smell of shampoo and playground dirt and childhood. His stuffed animals were arranged on his bed, exactly how he'd left them. His Lego creations covered every surface, spaceships and buildings and vehicles he'd been so proud of. His drawings were pinned to the walls, pictures of our family that always included Marcus as an angel watching over us. I collapsed on his bed and cried for hours. Cried until my throat was raw. Cried until I couldn't breathe. Cried until there were no tears left. The doorbell rang late that afternoon. I considered not answering it. Considered pretending I wasn't home. But it rang again, and again, insistently. Whoever was there wasn't going away. I dragged myself downstairs, opened the door. My family stood there. All 4 of them. My mother, Victoria, Thomas, Michelle, looking expectant, looking like they had something important to discuss. And then Victoria asked the question that shattered whatever remained of our relationship. We couldn't make it to the funeral because it was Jason's birthday party, but we're here now to discuss the trust fund. When do we get the money? The confrontation that followed was even worse than I initially described. They didn't just ask about the money. They had actually prepared arguments. Victoria pulled out her phone and showed me a spreadsheet. Look, I've broken down what I think is fair. Jason's private school costs $25,000 a year. Emma's will cost the same when she starts next year. That's $50,000 a year for the next 10 years minimum. I think $500,000 from Dylan's trust would be appropriate for their education. Are you insane? I asked, staring at her. Dylan has been dead for 9 days and you've made a spreadsheet? I'm being practical, Victoria said defensively. Someone has to think practically about these things. You're too emotional right now to make good financial decisions. Thomas pulled out papers from his back pocket. Actual printed documents. I've consulted with a financial advisor. My debt is $175,000. Credit cards, car loans, personal loans. If I could get $200,000 from Dylan's trust, I could pay off my debt and have a fresh start. That's reasonable, Catherine. That's family helping family. You consulted a financial advisor about my dead son's trust fund? We're just trying to be smart about this, Thomas said. The money exists. Dylan doesn't need it anymore. It makes sense to distribute it among family members who can actually benefit from it. My mother stepped forward, her voice taking on that authoritative tone she'd used when I was a child, and she wanted to assert control. Catherine, I've been doing some research. In most states, when a minor dies, their assets are distributed among surviving family members according to intestacy laws. The trust might specify that the money goes to you, but we could challenge that in court. We could argue that the trust creators didn't anticipate Dylan dying so young, that their intent was to benefit the family broadly, that distributing the money among multiple family members better serves the spirit of the trust. You've been researching how to legally steal my son's trust fund? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. You've been talking to lawyers? We haven't hired anyone yet, my mother said. We wanted to try to work this out privately first, family to family, without getting courts and lawyers involved unnecessarily. But Catherine, you need to understand. We have legitimate claims to that money. Dylan was our family too. We deserve to benefit from his trust fund just as much as you do. You didn't come to his funeral, I said, my voice shaking with rage. You chose a birthday party over his funeral. You didn't care enough about Dylan to say goodbye to him, but you care enough about his money to research intestacy laws and consult financial advisors and make spreadsheets about how to divide it. Up? Do you hear how insane that is? We loved Dylan, Victoria protested. We're devastated by his death. But love doesn't pay for Jason and Emma's education. Love doesn't pay off Thomas's debt. Love doesn't help Mom with her retirement. We have real financial needs that Dylan's money could address. Dylan's money was meant for Dylan, I said. Not for you, not for your children, not for Thomas's debt, not for Mom's retirement. It was meant for Dylan's future. Since Dylan doesn't have a future, it comes to me. That's what the trust says. That's what the law says. That's what's going to happen. We'll see about that, Victoria said, her voice turning cold. We'll see what a judge says when we explain that you're keeping $2 million that could benefit the entire family. We'll see what a court decides about fair distribution. Get out, I said. Get out of my house right now. They argued for another 15 minutes. They pleaded. They reasoned. They threatened. They tried every approach. Finally, when I threatened to call the police, they left. But as Victoria walked out the door, she turned back. This isn't over, Catherine. That money is family money. We're not going to let you keep it all for yourself just because you're Dylan's mother. We have rights. We're going to fight for what's fair. That was 6 months ago. What followed was A nightmare of harassment that went beyond what I initially described. My mother started a social media campaign. She posted on Facebook about how I was keeping Dylan's trust fund all to myself instead of sharing it with the family. She didn't mention that they'd skipped his funeral. She left that part out. She just painted me as a greedy daughter refusing to help her struggling mother and siblings. Some of her friends left comments supporting her, saying I should share the money with family. I had to make my Facebook account private and block hundreds of people. Victoria started telling people in our hometown that I'd inherited millions and was refusing to help family members in need. She told mutual acquaintances that I was living in luxury while her children might have to switch to public school because she couldn't afford private school tuition. She painted herself as the victim, the struggling mother whose selfish sister wouldn't help her. Thomas showed up at my house drunk multiple times, not just once. The first time I called the police and they removed him. The second time he was more aggressive, pounding on the door and yelling loud enough that neighbors called the police before I had to. The third time he tried to break a window, and that's when I finally got a restraining order. My mother hired a lawyer, the one who eventually represented them in probate court. He sent me multiple letters demanding that I discuss the fair distribution of Dylan's trust fund. Each letter came with certified mail, requiring my signature, making sure I couldn't claim I hadn't received them. Each letter outlined their claims to the money: Victoria's children's educational needs, Thomas's debt situation, my mother's retirement concerns. I had to hire my own lawyer to respond to these letters. James Morrison, a trusts and estates attorney, cost me $350 an hour. Over 6 months, legal fees defending myself against my own family's frivolous claims cost me over $25,000. They contested the trust distribution in court, as I mentioned. Victoria filed a claim asserting that she had rights to Dylan's assets as his aunt. The claim was ridiculous. She had no legal standing whatsoever, but it had to be responded to. It had to be defended against. James had to prepare documents. We had to appear in court for a preliminary hearing. Victoria's lawyer argued that the trust terms were unfair and should be reinterpreted to benefit the broader family. The judge at that preliminary hearing dismissed the claim quickly, but not before saying to Victoria, "Ms. Sullivan, trust documents are legal contracts. You can't just decide you don't like the terms and ask a court to change them. The trust explicitly states that if the beneficiary dies before age 25, the money goes to the surviving parent or parents. That's clear and unambiguous. You have no legal basis for challenging this. I'm dismissing your claim and suggesting you not waste any more of this court's time." But they didn't stop. 2 months after that dismissal, Thomas filed his own separate claim, arguing that as Dylan's uncle, he should inherit a portion of the estate. This claim was even more ridiculous than Victoria's. James filed a motion to dismiss it immediately, calling it frivolous and potentially sanctionable. The judge dismissed it and warned Thomas that filing additional frivolous claims could result in sanctions. Throughout all of this, I was also trying to grieve my son and heal from my own injuries. I was in physical therapy for my broken arm and ribs. I was in counseling for PTSD from the accident and complicated grief from losing Dylan. I'd had to take a leave of absence from teaching because I couldn't function well enough to be responsible for a classroom of 7-year-olds, and my family was harassing me constantly about money. Richard and Ellen Whitmore were furious about my family's behavior. They couldn't believe that people would skip a child's funeral and then demand his trust fund. They offered to help however they could. Financial support for legal fees, character testimony if needed, anything to help me defend against these absurd claims. Dylan's trust was meant for Dylan, and now it's yours, Richard told me multiple times. We set it up that way intentionally. We trust you, Catherine. We know you'll honor Dylan's memory. We know you'll use the money appropriately. Your family's behavior is reprehensible, and we'll do whatever we can to support you. That support meant everything to me during those dark months. Finally, we got to the probate hearing where the trust would be officially distributed. The final hearing where a judge would rule definitively on the trust distribution and hopefully end this nightmare. The courtroom scene I described happened largely as I told it, but there were additional details worth mentioning. When Judge Reeves asked where my family was during Dylan's funeral, the silence was deafening. My mother actually tried to defend their decision initially. "Your Honor, it was a very difficult situation. We had to make an impossible choice between two important events. One was a child's funeral, and one was a birthday party, Judge Reeves interrupted. That's not an impossible choice. That's actually a very easy choice for anyone with basic human decency and appropriate priorities. But Jason had been looking forward to his party for months, Victoria said. We'd spent thousands of dollars on it. All his friends were invited. We couldn't just cancel. You couldn't leave early? Judge Reeves asked. The funeral was at 2 p.m. You couldn't attend a noon birthday party for an hour and then leave to go to the funeral. The magician was hired for 1:30 to 2:30, Victoria explained, as if this was a reasonable justification. Jason wanted to see the magician. We couldn't leave before that. Judge Reeves stared at her. Let me make sure I understand. Your 7-year-old nephew died. His funeral was scheduled for 2 p.m., your son's birthday. Party had a magician performing from 1:30 to 2:30, and you chose to stay for the magician rather than leave to attend your nephew's funeral? When you say it like that, it sounds bad, Victoria said defensively. But Jason really wanted to see the magician. We'd paid $600 for him. We couldn't just leave. Miss Sullivan, I have 3 children, Judge Reeves said. If one of my siblings lost a child, I would explain to my children that something very sad happened and we need to go pay our respects. I would leave whatever party or event we were at. I would teach my children that showing up for family during grief is more important than any entertainment or celebration. The fact that you couldn't do that tells me everything I need to know about your priorities and your values. She turned to my mother. And you, Mrs. Hendricks? You're the grandmother. You lost a grandson. How do you justify not attending his funeral? I thought it was more important to support Victoria and her children at Jason's party, my mother said. They needed me there. Your daughter who'd just lost her child needed you at the funeral, Judge Reeves said sharply. How did you prioritize supporting Victoria at a party over supporting Catherine at a funeral? My mother had no answer. Judge Reeves then asked about the timing of their first visit to me after the funeral. When they confirmed they'd come 3 days after the funeral specifically to discuss the trust fund, her expression turned to disgust. And Ms. Sullivan, what exactly did you say when you arrived at your sister's home 3 days after she'd buried her child? Victoria looked uncomfortable. I don't remember exactly. Yes, you do, Judge Reeves said. What were your first words to your grieving sister? Victoria looked at her lawyer, who nodded that she should answer. I asked about the trust fund, when we could discuss it. You didn't express condolences first? You didn't ask how she was doing? I'm sure I said something like that too. Ms. Whitmore, Judge Reeves turned to me. What were your sister's exact first words to you when she arrived at your home 3 days after the funeral? I took a breath. She said, We couldn't make it to the funeral because it was Jason's birthday party, but we're here now to discuss the trust fund. When do we get the money? Those were her exact words. The courtroom was completely silent. Even the court reporter had stopped typing to stare at Victoria. When do we get the money? Judge Reeves repeated. That was your opening statement to your sister who'd just buried her child? Victoria's face was red. I didn't mean it to sound. How else could it possibly sound? Judge Reeves asked. Ms. Sullivan, Mr. Hendricks, Mrs. Hendricks, your behavior has been unconscionable. You skipped a child's funeral for a birthday party. You investigated that child's finances while he was dying. You showed up days after his burial demanding access to his trust fund. You've spent 6 months harassing his mother, filing frivolous legal claims, and wasting this court's time. All because you want money that you have absolutely no legal or moral right to. She looked at Richard and Ellen. Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, when you established this trust for your grandson, you specified that if he died before age 25, his surviving parent would inherit the trust. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor, Richard said, standing. That was always our intention. We wanted to make sure that if anything happened to Dylan, his mother would have financial support. We trust Catherine completely. We know she'll use the money appropriately to honor Dylan's memory. And you're aware that the claimants, the maternal grandmother, aunt, and uncle, have been attempting to gain access to this trust? Yes, Your Honor. We're disgusted by their behavior. They didn't even attend Dylan's funeral. They have no right to his trust fund. None whatsoever, Judge Reeves nodded. She looked at my family with undisguised contempt. I've been on the bench for 23 years. I've presided over countless estate disputes, I've seen families fight over money in ways that would shock most people, but I have never seen anything as appalling as what I've seen in this case. You people should be ashamed of yourselves. She turned to me. Ms. Whitmore, I'm ruling in your favor. The trust will be distributed to you according to its terms. Additionally, I'm awarding you attorney's fees. The claimants will be required to reimburse you for the legal costs you've incurred defending against their frivolous claims. Mr. Chen, your clients will be responsible for paying Ms. Whitmore's legal fees, which I understand are substantial. My family's lawyer looks stricken. Over $25,000 in legal fees that they'd now have to pay. Furthermore, Judge Reeves continued, I'm ordering that the claimants are prohibited from contacting Ms. Whitmore regarding this trust or any financial matters related to the deceased minor. Any further contact will be considered harassment and may result in contempt charges. This claim is dismissed with prejudice. This hearing is concluded. After the hearing, outside the courtroom, my family tried one more time. They followed me to the parking lot. Victoria was crying, saying she was sorry, that she'd made mistakes, that she'd been stressed and not thinking clearly. Please, Catherine, she begged. I know I handled things badly. I know I should have been at the funeral. I know I shouldn't have asked about money so soon. But I'm your sister. We're family. Can't we work this out? We're not family, I said, unlocking my car. Family shows up. Family supports each other during grief. Family doesn't skip funerals for birthday parties and then demand trust funds. You're just people I used to know. People who showed me exactly who they really are. And I believe them. But what about Jason and Emma? Victoria said. They're your niece and nephew. They're innocent in all this. Are you going to cut them out of your life because of my mistakes? You chose a birthday party over a funeral, Victoria. You made that choice. You prioritized Jason's entertainment over supporting me during the worst moment of my life. You chose your children over my dead child. Now you live with the consequences of that choice. My mother tried one last time. Catherine, please. I'm your mother. Doesn't that mean anything to you? Don't you have any love for your family? I loved my family, I said. I loved Dylan. I loved Marcus. I loved the Whitmores who've shown me what real family looks like. I loved my friends who showed up at the funeral you couldn't be bothered to attend. I loved the people who've supported me during the worst 6 months of my life. But I don't love people who value money over compassion. I don't love people who skip funerals for birthday parties. I don't love you. Not anymore. I got in my car and drove away. I didn't look back. The weeks that followed brought closure in various ways. The trust money was transferred to my account. $2 million appeared in my checking account, money that had been meant for my son's future. I cried when I saw the transfer notification. Cried because it was real. Because Dylan was really gone. Because this money was compensation for the absence of my child. I made decisions about how to use it. I paid off my mortgage, $180,000, leaving me with a paid-off home. I fully funded my retirement accounts, another $100,000, set aside $200,000 for my own financial security and future needs. The rest, nearly $1.5 million, I donated and allocated to causes Dylan would have cared. About $500,000 to pediatric cancer research at Marcus's hospital. In Marcus Whitmore's name, $300,000 to establish the Dylan Whitmore Memorial Scholarship Fund at my school district, providing scholarships for children in foster care. $200,000 to MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, for prevention and advocacy work. $200,000 to the Children's Museum Dylan had loved, to fund free admission days and educational programs. $100,000 to St. Andrew's Church to fund their youth programs and community outreach. $100,000 to establish a dinosaur exhibit at the local Natural History Museum called the Dylan Whitmore Dinosaur Discovery Center. $100,000 to NASA's educational outreach programs, funding astronomy education for children. Every dollar was used to honor Dylan's memory and make a positive difference in the world. The trust fund that had caused so much family strife was transformed into something beautiful: scholarships and research and education and prevention. It became Dylan's legacy. My family made one last attempt to contact me about a month after the probate hearing. My mother sent a certified letter. A long, rambling, 6-page handwritten letter. She wrote about how she'd been reflecting on everything that had happened. How she realized she'd made terrible mistakes. How she'd been raised to value money and status above relationships, and had passed those values on to Victoria and Thomas. How she'd prioritized the wrong things, Jason's party over Dylan's funeral, potential inheritance over supporting me in grief, financial gain over family relationships. She wrote that she was ashamed of herself, that she'd lost sleep thinking about her choices, that she understood why I'd cut them off, that she didn't expect forgiveness, but wanted me to know she was genuinely sorry. She wrote about Dylan, memories from when he was younger, things she'd never bothered to mention when he was alive. How proud she'd been when Dylan had explained black holes to her when he was 6, using scientific terms she'd had to look up later. How he'd always hugged her when they visited, never holding grudges even when she was distracted or didn't pay him enough attention. How he'd drawn her a picture once of them together, with "I love Grandma" written in his careful 7-year-old handwriting. She wrote that she hadn't appreciated Dylan enough when he was alive, that she'd taken him for granted, assuming there would always be time to build a relationship with him, that she'd valued her other grandchildren more because they lived closer and she saw them more often, that she hadn't realized until he was gone how much she'd miss him, how permanent his absence would be, how she'd squandered opportunities to really know him. She wrote that she'd been wrong about the trust fund, that it should go to me, that I was Dylan's mother, that honoring my choices about how to use it was the right thing to do, that she wished she'd supported me instead of harassing me. That money was meaningless compared to relationships, and she'd destroyed our relationship over money she had no right to. She ended the letter with, "I understand if you never forgive me. I wouldn't forgive me if I were you, but I want you to know that I'm sorry, truly sorry, for everything. I'm sorry I wasn't at Dylan's funeral. I'm sorry I prioritized the wrong things. I'm sorry I failed you as a mother when you needed me most. I love you, Catherine. I always have, even when I did a terrible job of showing it. I'm sorry, I read the letter 3 times. Then I put it in a drawer with Victoria's earlier apology letter. Maybe someday I'd respond. Maybe someday I'd be able to forgive them, at least partially. But not now, not yet. The wounds were too deep, too fresh, too devastating. Maybe someday I'd let them back into my life in some limited capacity. Maybe someday I'd let them meet whatever future family I might have. Maybe someday I'd be able to separate their terrible behavior during the worst period of my life from the entirety of our relationship. But that day wasn't today. Maybe it would never come. For now I had to focus on healing. On learning to live in a world without Dylan. On honoring his memory through the trust fund allocations and through how I lived my life going forward. On building relationships with people who'd shown up for me, Richard and Ellen, my friends, my colleagues, my support network of people who understood grief and loss. On the first anniversary of Dylan's death, September 23rd of this year, I held a small memorial at his grave. Just me, Richard and Ellen, and a few close friends. We released balloons with messages written on them. We told Dylan stories. We cried together. We remembered a beautiful boy who'd been taken too soon. That evening, I went home to my paid-off house, paid for with Dylan's trust fund. I sat in Dylan's room, which I'd kept exactly as he left it. I held Rex the dinosaur and talked to my son like he could hear me. I miss you every single day, buddy. Every minute of every day I miss you. I wish you were here. I wish we'd never gotten in the car that morning. I wish the drunk driver had stayed home. I wish you'd gotten to grow up and become the amazing person I know you would have been. But I want you to know I honored your memory. Your trust fund, the money Grandpa and Grandma Whitmore set aside for your future, I protected it. I didn't let the people who didn't love you enough take it. I used it for good things. For cancer research so other kids might not lose their daddies like you lost yours. For scholarships so kids without families have chances to succeed. For stopping drunk drivers so other families don't get destroyed like ours was. For museums and education and all the things you loved. Your money is helping people, buddy. It's making the world better. That's what you would have wanted. That's your legacy. And I want you to know I stood up for you. When people tried to profit from your death, I fought them. When they tried to take what was yours, I stopped them. When they tried to reduce you to a dollar amount, I reminded the world that you were a person. A beautiful, brilliant, kind person who mattered. I love you, Dylan. I'll always love you. Until I die and we're together again, I'll carry you in my heart. Rest with your daddy. Be at peace. Know that your mommy loves you forever. I sat there for a long time, holding Rex, crying quietly, feeling the weight of loss and love and grief. My family had skipped my child's funeral for a birthday party. They'd demanded his trust fund 3 days later. They'd harassed me for 6 months, trying to take money they had no right to. But they'd failed. The probate court had protected me and Dylan's legacy. The judge had recognized their behavior for what it was: greedy, cruel, unconscionable. The trust had been distributed according to its terms, to the person it was always meant to go to, Dylan's mother. And most importantly, I'd learned who my real family was. Not the people who shared my DNA but skipped the funeral. The people who showed up, who supported me, who valued relationships over money, compassion over convenience, love over greed. Richard and Ellen Whitmore were my family. My friends who'd held me while I sobbed were my family. The teachers and parents who'd attended Dylan's funeral were my family. The people who'd sent cards and called and checked on me and showed up during the darkest time were my family. Blood doesn't make you family. Showing up makes you family. And my blood relatives had shown me they weren't family at all. If you're watching this and you've experienced loss, you know that grief never really ends. It changes, evolves, becomes something you carry rather than something that drowns you. But it's always there. And if you're watching this and you have toxic family members who value money over relationships, who show their true colors during your darkest moments, believe what they show you. Don't make excuses. Don't give them chances they haven't earned. Protect yourself and your loved ones' legacies from people who would exploit tragedy for profit. My son's trust fund is now being used for good. His memory is being honored. His name lives on through scholarships and research and educational programs, and the people who tried to profit from his death got exactly what they deserved. Nothing but the shame of their own behavior and the knowledge that they destroyed their relationship with me forever, over money they never had any right to. Subscribe for more stories about standing up for yourself, protecting what matters, honoring the memories of those we've lost, and learning to distinguish between people who are really family and people who are just related by blood. Thanks for watching. Rest in peace. Dylan James Whitmore. April 12, 2016, September 23, 2023. Beloved son. Forever loved. Forever missed. Forever 7.